Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, with the fourth entry in a series entitled Life is Layered. Today's talk I'm entitling Psychological Substance. Last time, I reminded all of us, including myself, that there's more to life than self-preservation, to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, particularly if the comfort that we're looking for comes at the expense of others' comfort and their security and their rights to freedom of speech and to education. I think we should do far more to help out those who are in need, to eliminate injustice where we find it, and to empower the disenfranchised to fight for their rights themselves, to tell their stories without our having to do it for them. Is the drive for equity, then, all that really matters? Should we be preoccupied with distributing resources as equitably as possible and opportunities as equitably as possible? Does it matter why we do a thing? If I take my savings and give them all to a charity, but do so bitterly, resentfully, does it matter? If my money is helping a philanthropic venture to reach out to those in need, who cares how I feel about the money that I've given? If I'm a medical doctor and during a pandemic I decide to leave the country for 2 years and leave my family behind in order to give my services free of charge to those who cannot pay for medical care themselves in an undeveloped country, and I lose my life in the process, does it matter if I also developed a drug addiction and my wife divorced me and my children can't remember who I am? Does it matter in the greater scheme of things? Do personal issues matter in the face of the greater good? Should we wholeheartedly embrace a utilitarian principle that says that whatever benefits the greatest number of people, including the greatest percentage within a disenfranchised group, constitutes the greatest good possible? The philosopher C.S. Lewis maintained that while we should concern ourselves with social justice, it does matter, and matters deeply, that we can fixate on it at the expense of our own personal issues, those deeply ingrained private issues that are much more uncomfortable to think about, but arguably just as important. In chapter 4 of his book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis writes, this is back in 1940, "A reaction in itself wholesome is now going on against purely private or domestic conceptions of morality, a reawakening of the social conscience. We feel ourselves to be involved in an iniquitous or evil social system and to share a corporate guilt. This is very true. But beware lest you are making use of the idea of corporate or shared guilt to distract your attention from those humdrum, old-fashioned guilts of your own, which have nothing to do with the system and which can be dealt with without waiting for the millennium." For instance, think about the guilt that we all share from being complicit in slave labor, right? Unless everything that you buy is fair trade, it is likely that some pairs of shoes that you're wearing on your feet were made under slave conditions, essentially, in South America, where a fair wage is not being paid, where there are poor working conditions that are not beneficial to the health of the workers. And the same goes for the electronic innards in your tablet, in your laptop, in your cell phone, which are made under poor conditions in Asia. Now, this kind of guilt can be heavier for some of us, but still it's weight that is distributed across many, many shoulders. We're not carrying all of it on our own. And therefore, it's a little bit easier to think about these problems that we are a part of instead of those personal issues, those skeletons which we would rather keep hidden away in a closet, or better yet, a dank, dark, and very, very deep basement, those things which we would like to ignore and actually can successfully ignore pretty easily if we choose to. I'd like to suggest that internal invisible motivations do matter, though we should admit from the outset that motivation is a very messy matter. Any one action can always be attributed to many, many different motivating factors. I really became aware of this when taking Introduction to Psychology in college. Up to that point, I had been planning on becoming an engineer of some kind. I was still taking a lot of math courses and science courses. But Introduction to Psychology blew my mind. It so transformed the way that I looked at my own behavior and my thoughts and my desires and my fears that I decided this is really important stuff. I need to major in psychology and maybe one day be a family counselor. That was my goal moving throughout college. It would change later on yet again, but that drove me for quite some time. I want to share with you some of the realizations, the epiphanies that I had in Introduction to Psychology. One is that appearances can be highly deceptive. And I'm not talking about bone structure, the size of your eyes, about beauty, about height, about build. I'm not talking about morphology and physiognomy, the way that we tend to make lots of decisions based on the way people look. I'm talking more about the way they appear in motion, as concerns their personality, their temperament, and some of the stuff that they may have been through in their lives. So, for instance, one person who's very kind and gentle, who's easy to get along with and often defers to other people's opinions, may not be as healthy as they appear. It could be that some serious trauma in their past has created a kind of learned helplessness so that they are not acting out in their environment in a way that's actually going to help them to realize their dreams. Perhaps they are afraid, and that fear manifests in a socially acceptable way as gentleness. Someone else who we might consider aggressive because they are loud and they get angry a lot and they express themselves, or at least they're angry more often than we're comfortable with, it's possible that they're actually healthy because they're expressing how they feel. They're getting it out, which helps them physiologically, so they're not carrying all this tension, and it actually can help them deal with things psychologically, therapeutically, because they're actually expressing what's on their minds instead of holding back, suppressing it, and then getting more and more tense about an issue. It's possible that someone that irritates us in this way is actually healthier, and we're probably going to be healthier too because we actually know what's on their minds. It may not be fun all the time, but at least they're holding forth about what lies within. The surrealist painter Salvador Dali, who was heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud in the 1920s and 30s, writes in his essay, The Moral Position of Surrealism, this is 1930, that the practical actions of normal people are, quote, grievously betrayed by automatism. And he's talking about the systems which shape our thoughts, which we tend to think are rather logical when we admit that those systems exist. He argues that they're, if we're honest with ourselves, quite irrational, driven by fears and desires that we don't want to admit exist. Normal, this is my second idea, normal is a fiction when it comes to mental health. I'm convinced that everyone on the planet at some point or another could be diagnosed as clinically mentally ill. It could be because they have serious depression, they're dealing with grief, and that leads them into clinical depression, perhaps anxiety as a result. That some of us have debilitating paranoia at times, that we're overly preoccupied with what others are thinking, and that can actually freeze us in place. That some of us, because of work-related stress or family problems, have serious problems sleeping, so insomnia, which is also a clinical diagnosis. Some of us, because we're very preoccupied with cleanliness, can become obsessive compulsive, and this can be spawned by something that's relatively normal, like bringing home a child from the hospital and being very hypersensitive about cleanliness because you don't want them to catch something again because it threatened their life just weeks earlier, right? And I, as a kid, had this, what I would call obsessive compulsive desire to balance things. If I ran my hand along a rail going down the stairs, then sometimes I felt the need to go back up the stairs and run my hand along the rail down the other side to balance the surface area being touched on an object, or clicking a television control. They used to be on the television themselves, no remote controls in the 70s and early 80s. And I would feel that I needed to click, click, and then click, click, click back the other direction. That's obsessive compulsive. When I teach certain novels, like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, from the 1920s, I try to emphasize to my students that these kinds of mental problems exist in all of us at different times. Virginia Woolf, she actually dealt with suicidal ideation. She had attempted to commit suicide a few times before she wrote Mrs. Dalloway. And she takes her own issues and projects them into a couple of her characters. One is named Septimus. He is a soldier who's back from World War I, the Great War, and he's suffering what then we would have called shell shock. Now we'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And he seems to be crazy in a traditional sense. Much of what he says doesn't make a lot of sense, and his wife has difficulty discerning what he means, and he actually ends up taking his own life. There's another character named Clarissa Delay who's warmly embraced by the elite level of society, the aristocracy. These are the circles that she moves among. And yet, despite the fact that she seems to be normal, to be better than normal, to have this enviable joie de vivre, because she walks out the door and just breathes in the air and loves looking at flowers, there seems to be some joy there, not just happiness. Within her, she has what I would call a morbid preoccupation with the past. And this uncovers itself very slowly in the novel, to the point where we realize that when she learns of Septimus's suicide, she finds something enviable in it. She thinks about escaping responsibility and taking her own life. But she looks normal. A third idea that I ran into as a psychology major was this notion that our conscious decisions shape all our actions. That is a falsehood. I realized, learning about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, that much of what I did and felt was not within my conscious control. So let's take classical conditioning. I was dating Tracy at the time, and I had this strong affection for her, so that when I saw her walking across campus at a distance, I would get butterflies in my stomach. There would be a physiological reaction. I'd feel warm inside, all right? Now, she drove a Volvo 240, a white car, and over time, because I associated her with the car, if I saw a white Volvo 240 driving around town, I would start to have normal reactions to being in her presence in response to the car. The car itself is not part of Tracy. So two very unlike things, which originally garner very different responses from me, are paired together over time such that the presence of one causes a response associated naturally with the other. Another example. I don't tend to like dusty things, but when visiting my grandmother in Windsor, Missouri, back when I was a kid, in the summers this would happen, usually for a week or two at a time, I loved getting into her attic. There were some very steep wooden stairs that I would carefully climb to try not to fall backwards, up into a cavernous area that had trunks and chests full of decaying paper and clothing and sometimes toys. And so there was a musty, dank, and very dusty smell up there, which I didn't normally enjoy. But because of the adventure associated with those explorations, I came to like the smell. So that today, if I ever smell something very similar, I automatically have a pleasant sensation, even if my nasal system is not happy with what I'm taking into my nasal passages and into my lungs. I have bronchial asthma, right? There's still a positive association there. There's another example of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning refers to rewarding or punishing certain behaviors. And some of this happens within our consciousness. I was sometimes spanked for bad behavior when I was a kid, or disciplined in other ways, and rewarded with praise, with prizes for doing well in school or piano or whatever. I understood that kind of reward and punishment system. I did not realize until I was a psychology major that if you want to encourage a certain kind of behavior, consistent reinforcement or consistent punishment is not the best way to get that behavior to recur. Did you know that? Actually, intermittent, inconsistent reinforcement is the best way to encourage a certain kind of behavior. And this applies to whether you're trying to get a rat to press a little bar to receive a food pellet, which I did my junior year, I believe, in college, or you're trying to encourage certain behavior in the classroom. Consistently responding to certain kinds of behavior with either some kind of discipline or some kind of reward is not the best way to discourage or to encourage a certain kind of behavior. Inconsistency can sometimes be a very effective way to encourage behavior. And then another thing that I realized as a psychology major, which also applies to life today, I learned that dreams aren't necessarily irrelevant. Now, the rise of empiricism has led many people to dismiss dreams as inconsequential, but throughout the world, in most cultures, there are those who believe that dreams matter quite a bit. Sometimes because there might be a belief in the divine. So we find that this not just in ancient Mesopotamia and in ancient Israel, but also in the present, the idea that the divine, that God might actually reach into someone's life and speak to them through a dream or some kind of waking vision state. Others like the idea of there being layers within dreams, right? Christopher Nolan really perpetuated this idea, he and his brother, who I believe wrote the script, with the film Inception, looking at the idea that within dreams, you can dream within a dream and go deeper and deeper into more profound recognition, more profound realizations about who you actually are as a person. That there might be some integral truths hidden at very low levels of consciousness that you could reach by dreaming within a dream. I mean, you've probably experienced this, right? Waking up, but not really waking up because you're still within a dream. So that's the idea that Christopher Nolan is working with in that film. And there are those of us, we don't have to have taken psychology courses to recognize that oftentimes what we're dreaming about has some relevance to what we were living the day before, or a week before, a month before, sometimes years before. According to Freud, in The Interpretation of Dreams, this is one of his earlier books, everything that we dream has some connection to our lived experience, that there's nothing random. Even though it might seem sci-fi or fantastic, that it can be traced back to things which we have actually done. Some things that we have not come to a resolution about, that we're conflicted about. And this is not just extraordinary people who have dreams like this. This is everyone. I tend to believe that my dreams do matter. Sometimes that I might not be as prepared to accomplish something as I would like to be. I have a recurring dream that I am not ready to go on stage. And I have not been on stage in over 3 decades, at least not to act in a play. But just last night, I had a dream that I was not prepared for something. I don't know what it was, what the real issue was, but I dreamt that the curtain was about to go up and I did not know my lines. Yeah, that's a really fun dream to have. And then there's this other dream from my youth, which I had over and over again. And I can't really make heads or tails of it. Maybe you can help me decipher what this means. So in this dream, there's a soundscape, which I think was pulled from the film 2001 by Stanley Kubrick. I don't know when I would have seen this. Probably it was on television. And I walked through and heard it or something, and it really captured my imagination because I don't remember seeing the movie when I was a kid. So also Sprach Zarathustra is playing in the background. I'm in space, so this also lends me to thinking this is 2001. There's something very large in front of me. I don't remember the monolith from 2001, that big oblong, elongated, rectangular object that ends up on Earth and helps with evolution. I don't remember that specifically, but it's something very large and dark with this music in the background. And then the dream would switch to some things that were not in the film. Instead of switching to the Earth and watching primates, beating each other over the head with bones, what my imagination would do is take me to a field where I believe there were flowers and winds, probably birds, and there was a very comforting sense that I was now secure and I hadn't been in space. Very positive emotional associations. And despite the fact that there was no one around and no animals that I could see, maybe could hear a few, I did not feel alone. I felt very, very secure. Now, I could interpret this in terms of desire for control, fears associated with the vacuum of space, because I saw a lot of sci-fi movies when I was a kid, and sometimes people get thrown out the airlock and they die, right? Or maybe something to do with a belief that I am not alone, that there's that the supernatural exists. These are possibilities. There was something there that would bring me into a state of comfort, and a peace would descend on me. And then the film that's playing itself out in my imagination would end. Now, some psychologists would go so far as to say that belief in things that you cannot see is ridiculous, right? That there is no soul and there is no God. And when they say that there's no soul, often what they mean is they're not saying that we don't have a mind, or that there's not something there, right? That is a synergetic product of all of our physiological processes, but that does not exist after death, right? The early psychologist William James writes in 1892 that, quote, "Our inner faculties are adapted in advance to the features of the world in which we dwell." Our inner faculties are adapted. And he doesn't necessarily want to perpetuate the idea of soul. He's talking about mind and saying it's a response to our environment. Whatever lies within us, he's arguing, exists only insofar as it responds to stimuli in the world we inhabit. And most definitely, there is no transcendent moral system which shapes our behavior, which causes us to feel good when we do a good thing and to feel guilt. Guilt is a product of an archaic, outmoded moral system that we could probably beneficially get rid of. Many psychologists would argue this. When we're thinking about how to live better, there's no need to assign any value to whatever moral guilt that we might feel that's a product of the way we were raised. There are social ethics, and those are important to help regulate society and prevent chaos, but we don't actually need anything else beyond some sense of what's going on in our minds and a sense of what's going on in other people's lives and our material world to flourish. Many would actually say that a sense of morality, which brings with it both positive and negative emotions, is an obstacle to self-actualization. Do you agree? Or might there be yet another layer to reality? We'll explore this possibility next time.